The sun had just started to rise above the tall pines when the mist rolled low through the valley. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes before the day begins, when even the birds seem to wait. Mateo, 68 years old, moved slowly along the narrow trail he had walked for decades. His boots pressed softly into the damp ground, leaving a familiar pattern in the mud. He carried no camera, no phone, just a small walking stick, and the calm patience of a man who had spent most of his life among trees. His cabin sat half a mile behind him, a small wooden structure built by his own hands many years ago. The porch still creaked, the roof still leaked when it rained. But it was home. For Mateo, silence wasn't loneliness, it was comfort. He had been a park ranger once, the kind who knew every bend in the creek, every call of the night birds. People in town respected him for his honesty. Even after retirement, he still spent most mornings in the forest, keeping trails clear and checking on old landmarks. But this morning felt different. The air carried something heavier than fog. There was a stillness that made even the wind hesitate. Mateo paused near a line of pine trees, his breath visible in the cold air. Somewhere beyond the mist, something moved slow, deliberate, and large. He stood quietly, eyes searching through the fog. A faint sound echoed back deep, almost like a voice carried through the trees. Later, when asked about that moment, Mateo would simply say, "That was the morning everything changed. That was the morning Bigfoot spoke to me." Mateo's days followed a rhythm so steady that even the forest seemed to move with it. He woke at sunrise, boiled water on the old wood stove, and sat by the window as the morning mist lifted off the trees. The smell of pine smoke and damp earth filled the cabin, the same scent he'd known all his life. After breakfast, he stepped outside with his cane and fed the birds that gathered near the porch. Blue jays, wrens, and the same gray squirrel that had learned not to fear him. He often talked to them out loud, not because he expected an answer, but because silence could be too big sometimes. The forest around him was more than land, it was memory. Every trail reminded him of the years he spent as a park ranger, walking patrols, guiding lost hikers back to safety, and teaching children how to read animal tracks. Those days were long gone now, but the habit stayed. He still noted broken branches, still stopped to listen when the woods went quiet. His wife, Clara, had passed away 8 years ago. After she was gone, Mateo never left the forest for long. The town felt too noisy, too fast. Out here, under the pines, he could still feel her near in the soft wind, in the way sunlight touched the moss. Neighbors visited once in a while, mostly to bring him supplies or check if he needed anything. They called him the Old Ranger, a kind man who preferred peace over company. And that was true, peace was all he wanted. But lately, something had changed. Some nights, he woke to deep sounds from the valley, not thunder, not wind, heavy footsteps on the riverbed. Once, he found large impressions near the garden, too wide to be human, too clean to belong to any bear he'd ever seen. He told himself it was nothing, maybe a stray elk passing through, but a feeling lingered in his chest, quiet but firm. The forest was watching him. He didn't know it yet, but those sounds and footprints were not warnings. They were signs, the first messages from something he could never have imagined would one day speak to him. It was near dusk when Mateo first saw it clearly. The air had turned colder than usual, and a thin line of fog had begun to form over the creek behind his cabin. He carried a lantern that gave off a soft amber light, swinging gently as he walked. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual chatter of birds had faded. Only the sound of water moving slowly over stones filled the stillness. Mateo's boots sank into the damp earth with every step. He was heading toward the small wooden bridge he'd built years ago when something caught his attention, a sound unlike any he had heard before. It was deep and slow, almost like the sound of a log shifting under weight. Then came another, closer this time. heavy, rhythmic. Something was walking on two legs. Mateo stopped. The lantern light trembled slightly in his hand. Through the drifting fog, about 30 yards away, a shape began to take form. At first, it looked like a tree stump, wide, unmoving, but then it shifted. The figure straightened, taller than any man, its shoulders broad, its outline massive against the pale mist. Mateo's breath caught. He didn't move, didn't speak. The creature took one slow step forward. Its fur was dark brown with streaks of silver along the arms and chest. The faint light caught its eyes, a deep amber color, reflecting calm rather than anger. Mateo had seen every animal that lived in those woods: bears, elk, cougars, but nothing like this. For a long moment, neither moved. Mateo felt something strange. Not fear, but a heavy stillness, as if time itself had paused. He raised the lantern slightly. The creature tilted its head, almost mimicking his motion. It didn't snarl, didn't charge. It simply looked at him steady, intelligent, almost curious. Then, a faint sound came from its chest, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. Mateo didn't understand it, but it wasn't threatening. It sounded gentle. Before he could react, the creature took a step back, then another, retreating slowly into the fog. Within seconds, it vanished among the trees, leaving only silence behind. Mateo stood there for a long time, the lantern light flickering on his face. His heart was beating fast, but not from fear. Something in that brief encounter had shaken him deeper than any danger ever had. He knew he hadn't imagined it. The ground near the creek told the truth. Large footprints, nearly twice the size of his own, pressed cleanly into the mud. Mateo knelt beside them, touched the edge of one print, and whispered softly, "You're real." That night, as he sat by his cabin window, staring out into the darkness, he couldn't stop hearing that low hum, the sound that felt less like a warning and more like a beginning. It was near dusk when Mateo first saw it clearly. The air had turned colder than usual, and a thin line of fog had begun to form over the creek behind his cabin. He carried a lantern that gave off a soft amber light. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual chatter of birds had faded. Only the sound of water moving slowly over stones filled the stillness. Mateo's boots sank into the damp earth with every step. He was heading toward the small wooden bridge he'd built years ago, when something caught his attention, a sound unlike any he had heard before. It was deep and slow, almost like the sound of a log shifting under weight. Then came another closer this time, heavy, rhythmic. Something was walking on two legs. Mateo stopped. The lantern light trembled slightly in his hand. Through the drifting fog, about 30 yards away, a shape began to take form. At first, it looked like a tree stump, wide, unmoving, but then it shifted. The figure straightened, taller than any man. Its shoulders broad, its outline massive against the pale mist. Mateo's breath caught. He didn't move, didn't speak. The creature took one slow step forward. Its fur was dark brown with streaks of silver along the arms and chest. The faint light caught its eyes, a deep amber color, reflecting calm rather than anger. Mateo had seen every animal that lived in those woods: bears, elk, cougars, but nothing like this. For a long moment, neither moved. Mateo felt something strange, not fear, but a heavy stillness, as if time itself had paused. He raised the lantern slightly. The creature tilted its head, almost mimicking his motion. It didn't snarl, didn't charge. It simply looked at him steady, intelligent, almost curious. Then, a faint sound came from its chest, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. Mateo didn't understand it, but it wasn't threatening. It sounded gentle. Before he could react, the creature took a step back, then another, retreating slowly into the fog. Within seconds, it vanished among the trees, leaving only silence behind. Mateo stood there for a long time, the lantern light flickering on his face. His heart was beating fast, but not from fear. Something in that brief encounter had shaken him deeper than any danger ever had. He knew he hadn't imagined it. The ground near the creek told the truth. Large footprints, nearly twice the size of his own, pressed cleanly into the mud. Mateo knelt beside them, touched the edge of one print, and whispered softly, "You're real." That night, as he sat by his cabin window, staring out into the darkness, he couldn't stop hearing that low hum, the sound that felt less like a warning and more like a beginning. For the next several days, Mateo couldn't shake the memory of that night. Every sound in the forest seemed different now, every rustle, every breeze. He kept returning to the same creek where he'd seen the creature, hoping for another glimpse, but the woods offered only silence. Then one morning, he noticed something unusual near his garden fence, a pattern of small branches, laid carefully in the shape of a circle. They weren't scattered like storm debris. They were placed, each stick pointed inward. It looked deliberate. Mateo studied it quietly, crouching low. The ground, nearby, held, faint impressions large, soft outlines, half covered by leaves. The same as before. He didn't tell anyone. Instead, he began to watch more closely. Every few days, new signs appeared. Small piles of smooth stones arranged neatly by his porch. A bent sapling that seemed twisted with careful hands, not wind. At first, he thought it was coincidence, maybe animals or weather. But deep down, he knew better. The forest was trying to speak. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the light turned gold, Mateo stood outside his cabin, watching the tree line. The air was still. Then, from the shadows, movement slow, steady, familiar. The creature emerged halfway into the open, not too close, not too far. It stood there quietly, one massive hand resting on a nearby tree trunk. Mateo didn't move. He simply lifted his hand slightly, a small, cautious gesture of peace. To his surprise, the creature copied him, lifting its own hand, mirroring the motion almost perfectly. Mateo felt his throat tighten. There was no growl, no threat, only recognition. Then, the creature pointed toward the forest. Mateo didn't understand at first, but as he followed its gaze, the meaning became clear. The forest, the water, something connected. A message not spoken, but felt. Before disappearing back into the trees, the creature touched its chest with one hand, then touched the same tree again, softly. Mateo realized it was showing respect to the place itself. He stood there long after it vanished, the air still humming with something unseen. That night, he sat by his small fire, staring into the flames. "It's not just living here," he murmured to himself. "It's protecting it." From that evening on, Mateo began leaving small gifts by the creek apples, carved wood pieces, things that belonged to the forest. He didn't expect anything in return, but each time he went back, the offerings, things were gone, and in their place, new patterns appeared in the dirt, carefully shaped by hands that were not human. The silence had become a language, and Mateo was learning to listen. Weeks passed, and Mateo had grown accustomed to the quiet signs left by the creature. Each morning brought subtle new patterns, stones carefully stacked near the creek, branches arranged in precise shapes, leaves forming symbols he could not immediately understand. But Mateo felt that each movement, each placement, carried meaning. One late afternoon, The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Mateo followed the narrow trail to his favorite clearing, a place where the creek widened and the moss softened underfoot. He had brought nothing with him this time, only his presence and an open mind. From the shadows, the figure emerged again, taller than any man, broad-shouldered, fur dark brown streaked with silver. Its eyes met his, the same deep amber that seemed to look not just at him, but into him. Mateo did not speak. He didn't need to. The creature made a low, resonant sound, almost like a hum, vibrating through the air. Mateo felt it in his chest. It was not frightening. It was commanding yet gentle, full of intent. Slowly, the creature stepped closer and raised a massive hand, touching the mossy ground. Then it touched its chest, and finally, it pointed toward the creek, then the forest beyond. Mateo felt a wave of understanding. The creature's gestures were simple, deliberate, a language of emotion and observation. It was showing him the forest, the water, the life that thrived there, and the dangers that crept silently. He felt the message without hearing it with words. The forest is alive. The rivers remember. Humans have forgotten how to listen. Protect it. Respect it. Honor life. Mateo's eyes filled with tears. The words, though unspoken, resonated deeply. He realized this was not just an encounter with a wild creature. This was a messenger, an intelligent being trying to make humans aware of what they had ignored for far too long. The creature stepped back slightly, then touched its chest again, a gesture Mateo interpreted as trust, or perhaps a plea. It looked at him with a calm patience, the kind that only comes from a lifetime of understanding. Mateo nodded slowly, his hands trembling. "I understand," he whispered. The creature lingered for a moment longer, then turned and melted into the mist of the forest. Mateo remained in the clearing long after it had gone, listening to the subtle sounds of the creek and the whisper of the wind through the pines. That evening, as he sat by his cabin window, Mateo realized the weight of what he had received. It was not a story to tell lightly, nor something to prove. It was a responsibility, a message carried by a being most would dismiss as legend, yet real enough to change the way he saw the world. "It's not just about seeing," he murmured. "It's about listening, truly listening." The forest had spoken, and for the first time, Mateo felt that humans could still hear if they chose to. After the encounter in the clearing, Mateo felt a quiet responsibility. He knew the creature's message was too important to ignore. He began documenting what he saw, carefully and patiently. Each morning, he walked the trails near his cabin, notebook in hand, sketching impressions in the mud. The footprints were massive, almost twice the size of his own, with elongated fingers that left deep marks in soft soil. Some prints were fresh, others older, partially washed away by rain. He measured them, drew diagrams, and noted every detail. Branches and leaves arranged in deliberate patterns became another focus. Mateo photographed them, placing small markers to track changes over time. Stones stacked near the creek were counted, mapped, and observed for movement. Over days, a clear rhythm emerged. The creature was deliberate, leaving signs as if it wanted to communicate with him specifically. Mateo also kept track of sounds, low hums, distant footsteps, the rustle of heavy movement through the pines. He recorded times and directions, noting patterns that no ordinary animal could produce. Even the bird seemed aware of the presence, shifting nervously when the creature approached. One afternoon, he visited the site of the first encounter near the creek. The prints were still there, partially hidden by morning fog. He ran his hand lightly over the mud, feeling the shape of the fingers, the depth of the pressure. There was no doubt in his mind these were not human prints. nor anything he had ever seen in his decades as a ranger. He shared some of his sketches and notes with a few trusted friends, men who had worked alongside him in the park for years. They examined the evidence carefully, nodding, silently, though they stopped short of confirming what they suspected. Mateo didn't push. He knew that the truth mattered more than validation. At night, he reviewed his records by the fire, arranging his sketches and photos methodically. Each mark, each pattern, each print told a story, not just of a creature, but of intelligence, awareness, and purpose. And though he hadn't spoken to anyone outside his small circle yet, Mateo felt that the evidence alone carried weight. The forest was speaking through these signs. And now, for the first time, he had the proof to show that it wasn't just imagination. It was real. "I don't need them to believe me," he whispered. "I need only to understand." After the clearing encounter, Mateo felt a quiet responsibility. The creature's message was too important to be forgotten. He knew that without proof, most people would dismiss the events as a dream or a tale, no matter how sincere he was. So he began documenting everything carefully. Each morning, he walked the familiar trails near his cabin, notebook and pencil in hand. He sketched footprints pressed deep into the soft earth, noting the size far larger than a man's and the elongated fingers that left subtle marks. He measured distances between prints and traced the patterns of movement, recording the details with the precision of a lifetime spent observing nature. Near the creek, stones and branches had been arranged with intent. Mateo photographed the formations, marking them lightly with small twigs to track any changes. Over days, he began to see a pattern deliberate placement, almost like a language. Every pile, every line of stones carried meaning. Mateo also recorded sounds. The low, resonant hums from the forest returned at irregular times, sometimes accompanied by heavy, measured footsteps. He noted the timing, the direction, the subtle variations in tone. Even the birds and small animals seemed aware, scattering quietly when the creature passed. One afternoon, he returned to the site of his very first encounter. The footprints were still there, partially softened by rain. Running his hand lightly over the mud, he felt the depth and shape of the impressions. They were real, tangible. Nothing he had ever seen in decades of patrolling the forest resembled these tracks. He shared some sketches and notes with a few longtime friends from his ranger days. Men he trusted. They examined the material carefully, nodding thoughtfully, though none spoke outright of belief. Mateo didn't need confirmation. He had felt the truth in the forest itself. At night, he reviewed everything by the fire. Sketches, photographs, notes, each mark, each pattern, each sound seemed to tell the story of intelligence and purpose, of a being capable of observing, communicating, and leaving signs for him alone. "I don't need anyone to believe me," Mateo whispered softly. "I only need to understand." For the first time, he realized that documenting the evidence wasn't about convincing others. It was about listening carefully and honoring the message the forest had sent. After weeks of careful observation and documentation, Mateo felt it was time to share his findings. He reached out quietly to a few trusted contacts, men and women who had worked in wildlife research. People who respected evidence and patience above sensational claims. 2 scientists responded. Dr. Langley, a forest ecologist, and Dr. Hayes, a behavioral biologist, agreed to visit the area. They arrived on a cool morning, notebooks and measuring tools in hand, skeptical but open-minded. Mateo greeted them without fanfare, showing them the trails, the creek, and the spots where the signs appeared. The scientists knelt carefully in the mud, examining footprints that Mateo had recorded. They measured the lengths, the widths, and the spacing. Dr. Langley frowned thoughtfully. "This is unlike any known bear or large mammal in the region. he said quietly. They walked the trails, observing the stone formations and carefully arranged branches. Dr. Hayes took photographs, noting symmetry and repetition in the patterns. If this is intentional, she said, then it suggests a level of intelligence that is unusual, possibly even remarkable for a non-human species. Mateo didn't speak much. He simply showed them what he had seen, leaving interpretation to them. He had learned long ago that insisting on belief was pointless. Evidence spoke more clearly than words ever could. Over the next few days, the scientists returned several times, tracking footprints, photographing arrangements, and recording ambient sounds. They noted patterns in the hums that seemed to carry a rhythm deliberate, consistent. Though cautious, the scientists could not dismiss what they found. Each visit reinforced the same conclusion. Something unusual, intelligent, and deliberate was moving through these ententer woods. They could not explain it, but neither could they deny it. Before leaving, Dr. Langley said softly, almost to himself, "If what he describes is true, it's a reminder humans have stopped listening. Maybe there's more in these forests than we've ever understood." Mateo watched them pack their equipment, their faces thoughtful. No questions about sensationalism, no demands for proof beyond the evidence, just quiet respect. "You don't have to believe me," Mateo said quietly to the trees as they left. "Just understand what you see." He knew the forest had its own way of speaking, and now, even the scientists had glimpsed a part of that truth in footprints, in patterns, and in the quiet hum that seemed to echo through the valley. Weeks passed after the scientists' visits, and the forest settled into its familiar rhythm once more. Mateo continued his quiet routines, walking the same trails, feeding the birds, and observing the subtle signs left in the mud and under the trees. But deep inside, he felt anticipation, a quiet hope that he might see the creature again. One early morning, just as the sun began to rise, painting the mist in pale gold, Mateo walked toward the clearing by the creek. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet pine and moss. He paused, listening carefully, and there it was, the familiar presence, unmistakable, moving slowly through the fog. This time, the creature approached with deliberate calm. Mateo didn't raise a lantern or speak. He simply stood quietly, letting the moment unfold. Its amber eyes met his, warm and patient, as if recognizing not only him, but the understanding they had shared over the weeks. The creature stepped into the open clearing, placing a massive hand gently on a nearby tree. Mateo watched, holding his breath, as it lowered its head slightly, touching the earth in front of it. Then, it turned its gaze to Mateo, a gesture that felt almost human, a quiet acknowledgement, a farewell, and a shared respect for all that had transpired. Mateo felt a surge of emotion, awe, gratitude, and a strange, calming peace. He realized this was the final message. No words, no sounds, just the presence itself, full of meaning. The creature had shown him that the forest was alive, that life within it mattered, and that humans had a responsibility to care, even if they rarely noticed. Slowly, the figure retreated, moving toward the thick trees at the edge of the clearing. Mateo didn't call out. He didn't want to break the silence. The creature paused once, looking back over its shoulder. Mateo felt the weight of that gaze, an unspoken understanding that this would be the last encounter, at least for now. Then it disappeared into the mist, leaving only the sounds of the creek and the whispering wind. Mateo stood in the clearing for a long time, letting the stillness settle around him. Every detail, every pattern, every footprint he had being observed seemed to echo in his mind. The forest itself had become a language, and he had learned to read it. "I heard you," Mateo whispered softly. I understand. That day, and in the weeks that followed, he continued his life quietly. But something inside him had shifted. He walked more carefully, noticed the smallest signs of life, and left small offerings along the trails not to seek acknowledgement, but to honor the message he had received. The encounter had ended, but its impact lingered, a lesson in patience, respect, and the quiet power of listening to the world around us. Mateo knew he had been changed forever. News of Mateo's encounters traveled quietly at first. He did not seek attention, and the local media respected his wishes. Still, a small report reached a few researchers and journalists, summarizing the footprints, patterns, and strange sounds he had recorded. The scientist who had visited the forest returned to review their notes. Dr. Langley and Dr. Hayes remained cautious, acknowledging that what Mateo had described could not be fully explained. They published a brief, factual report. Careful language, no sensational claims, simply an observation of unusual signs in the forest. In the town, reactions were mixed. Some people laughed, dismissing Mateo's story as fantasy or exaggeration. Others, particularly older residents who had long respected his integrity, believed him without question. They knew the forest as he did and trusted his honesty. Mateo did not argue with anyone. He understood that belief was personal, and that the forest's truths did not require validation. What mattered was that he had seen, listened, and understood. Among the scientific community, interest quietly grew. Researchers discussed the evidence in private forums and papers, noting that while the signs did not constitute proof of a new species, they did suggest intelligence and deliberate behavior in ways previously unrecorded. Some admitted, almost reluctantly, that the message Mateo had received about respecting the forest and its creatures was valuable, even if they could not confirm the messenger. It's not about proving him right or wrong, Dr. Langley said to a colleague. It's about what he witnessed and what it teaches us about the world we often ignore. Mateo watched all of this from his cabin, quietly tending to his garden and walking the trails. The forest remained unchanged by public opinion, untouched by debate. The footprints, the patterns, the whispers in the wind all remained, silent and patient, waiting for anyone willing to see, to notice, to understand. He had not sought fame, nor recognition. What mattered was the message. What mattered was listening. I don't need them to believe me, Mateo whispered as he walked through the misty trees. I only need to understand. That is enough. And with that, the town moved on. The scientists documented what they could, and Mateo continued his quiet life forever, carrying the knowledge of what the forest had shared with him, and the lessons left by a messenger few had ever glimpsed. Mateo sat on the porch of his small cabin, watching the forest wake with the soft light of dawn. The pines swayed gently in the breeze. Birds flitted through the branches, and the creek glistened as it wound through the valley. Everything was as it had always been, yet nothing felt quite the same. He thought back to the first evening, when he had seen the towering figure through the mist, when footprints and patterns had first appeared on the forest floor. At the time, he had been filled with uncertainty, a mixture of awe and fear. Now, he understood. Those moments had been lessons not in fear, but in attention, patience, and respect. For weeks, he had listened, watched, and documented. He had shared what he could with scientists, yet he never sought proof or fame. The forest had its own voice, and only those willing to listen could hear it. He had learned that listening often mattered more than speaking. The creature had returned one final time, and in its quiet gestures, it had shared a message far deeper than words. The importance of protecting life, of understanding the rhythms of nature, of remembering that humans were only a part of a larger story. Mateo felt that message deeply in his chest, a hum, a heartbeat, a reminder of what was fragile and precious. Now, he continued his life quietly. He walked the same trails, planted new trees where old ones had fallen, left small offerings for the forest's creatures. He spoke little, yet he felt the presence of the forest and its messenger in every sound. Every rustle of leaves, every ripple of water. Maybe the forest still speaks, he whispered to himself. Maybe we just stopped listening. I didn't just hear Bigfoot's voice. I heard the voice of everything we've ignored. He wasn't a monster. He was a messenger. Mateo knew that the story would likely fade from memory for most people. Scientists would continue their studies, locals would debate, and the world would move on. But he also knew that the forest would endure, its lessons waiting patiently for anyone willing to notice. And for Mateo, that was enough. The quiet understanding, the sense of connection, the respect for life that had been shared with him, that was the true gift. He leaned back, eyes tracing the sun filtering through the pines, and smiled softly. I heard you, he said again, and I will always listen. The forest remained still, peaceful, and eternal, carrying its messages on the wind, waiting for those who were ready to hear.